Welcome to True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat and every scar tells a truth. Thank you for watching True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, and tell us in the comments. Do you believe redemption still exists in a world like this? The high desert breathed like a living thing at dusk, exhaling heat through cracked earth and sagebrush shadows. The land stretched wide and unforgiving, a place that remembered every footstep and judged every soul that crossed it. In this country, survival was not promised by mercy, only by endurance. It was here, along the far edge of a forgotten cattle trail, that fate bent its iron spine and changed two lives forever. The ranch stood alone against the horizon. A weather-beaten spread of timber and stone crouched beneath the vast western sky. Wind gnawed at its walls, sun scorched its roof, and time had carved its name deep into every post and beam. The man who lived there had earned his solitude the hard way. He rose before dawn, worked until the stars took command, and slept with one eye on the door, not from fear, but from habit. The land had taught him that trust was expensive and rarely returned in full. He was known as a rancher, though that word carried little weight in a place where titles were swallowed by dust. He was a man shaped by loss and responsibility, forged by years of silent labor. His hands were scarred from rope burns and splintered wood. His shoulders bore the weight of seasons that never asked permission before breaking a man's back. He had buried dreams beneath the soil, along with people he loved, and learned to keep moving because the land demanded it. That evening, as the sun bled red along the mesas, something disrupted the familiar rhythm of his world. At first it was only a shape, low, uneven, moving against the wind. The rancher paused mid-step, instincts sharpening. Out here, anything that moved without purpose was either dying or dangerous. He watched from the fence line, the quiet stretching thin as a blade. The shape stumbled, disappeared behind a rise, then emerged again, closer now, wrapped in dust and desperation. It was a woman. She moved like someone running from more than exhaustion. Her clothes were torn by thorns and travel, her dark hair tangled and heavy with grit. Blood had dried along her forearm, and her steps dragged as though the ground itself resisted her escape. Yet there was strength in her posture, a stubborn refusal to fall even when her body begged for rest. She carried the wild with her, not as a costume, but as a birthright. The rancher did not move immediately. He had learned that hesitation could save a life, sometimes his own. The Apache Wars had left scars across the territory, and fear traveled faster than truth. He had seen soldiers mistake shadows for enemies and neighbors turn away from starving souls. He had sworn never to be careless, but he had also sworn never to be cruel. When she finally collapsed near the edge of his land, the decision was made without ceremony. He carried her to the house with the same quiet resolve he used to haul calves from floods or mend broken fences in the dark. Her body was lighter than it should have been, hunger and travel having stolen its weight. Yet there was heat in her, a fierce pulse that spoke of survival. She smelled of smoke, sweat, and earth, as though the desert itself had shaped her. Inside the ranch house the air was cool and still. He laid her on the bed, the only bed, its blankets worn thin by years of solitary sleep. He cleaned her wounds with steady hands, noting the marks of capture narrowly avoided, the bruises that told stories of running hard and falling harder. There was no gentleness in the world she had fled, only pursuit. She slept deeply, the kind of sleep that overtakes someone who has outrun death by inches. Her breathing slowed, and in that quiet, the rancher became aware of something he had not felt in years: presence. The house, once hollow with memory, now held another heartbeat. The woman was Apache, that much was clear. Her features carried the legacy of a people who had endured removal, betrayal, and relentless violence. To be Apache in these times was to be hunted by law and legend alike. To shelter one was to invite consequences measured in bullets and fire. The rancher sat through the night, rifle within reach, listening to the wind test his walls. He told himself he was only keeping watch, that this was no different from guarding livestock. But deep down, he knew the truth had already shifted. He had crossed an invisible line the moment he carried her inside. By morning, the desert had reclaimed its harsh beauty. Sunlight poured through the window, catching on dust motes and the curve of her cheek. She woke slowly, eyes sharp despite her weakness, scanning the room with the instincts of someone who had learned survival early. There was no fear in her gaze, only calculation. She understood where she was. She understood what had been given. Among her people, sharing a sleeping place was not an act taken lightly. It carried meaning beyond shelter. It spoke of protection, of intention, of futures intertwined whether spoken or not. She did not need words to recognize the gravity of what had occurred. The land had its own language, and it had already spoken. The rancher felt the weight of her awareness. He said nothing, but silence did not shield him from consequence. In her culture, and perhaps in his own buried sense of honor, a boundary had been crossed. Not by desire, but by necessity. Not by choice, but by fate. She ate when he offered food, slowly, carefully, as if expecting it to vanish. Strength returned to her eyes before it returned to her body. She moved through the house like someone memorizing a place she might need to defend. Outside, the cattle lowed, and the world pretended nothing had changed. But everything had. Word traveled fast in the west, even without mouths to carry it. Tracks appeared near the property by afternoon, boot prints too orderly to belong to drifters, soldiers or bounty hunters, drawn by rumors of an Apache woman fleeing capture. The land whispered warnings through broken brush and disturbed soil. The rancher knew what harboring her meant. It meant choosing a side in a war he had tried to outlive. It meant risking the only thing he had left, his land, his freedom, his life. Yet when he looked at her standing in the doorway with the sun framing her like fire, he understood that some choices were made before a man ever knew he was choosing. She belonged to a future that would not let him remain alone. The desert wind rose again that evening, carrying with it the promise of pursuit and the threat of reckoning. As night fell, the rancher secured the doors, aware that sleep would not come easily. Somewhere beyond the hills, men were searching. Somewhere within his walls, a woman rested who carried more than her own survival. She carried change, and as the stars claimed the sky, the rancher stood between the past he had buried and the future that had arrived without asking. The land waited, patient and merciless, for what would come next. Morning arrived without softness. The desert did not believe in gentle awakenings, only in light that demanded attention and heat that reminded every living thing of its limits. The rancher stepped outside before the sun fully cleared the mesas, scanning the horizon with the practiced patience of a man who had learned to read danger in silence. The land spoke through broken grass, bent sage, and disturbed dust, and it was speaking louder now. The tracks were clearer in daylight. Boot prints, measured and purposeful, pressed into the dry soil near the outer fence line. They did not cross the boundary, not yet, but they circled it like wolves testing a corral. Whoever made them knew the terrain and understood restraint. That made them far more dangerous than men who rushed in with noise and confidence. Inside the house, the woman moved carefully, conserving strength. Her presence altered the rhythm of the ranch in ways that were impossible to ignore. The rooms felt smaller, warmer, charged with something unnamed. She did not speak, and neither did he, but silence between them was no longer empty. It carried meaning, memory, and expectation. She understood the danger as clearly as he did. Her eyes followed his movements, noting the way his hand rested near his rifle, the way he paused at windows before passing them. Among her people, survival had never depended on words alone. Observation was its own language, and she was fluent. The rancher prepared for a siege he hoped would never come. He checked ammunition, secured the barn, and moved livestock closer to the house under the excuse of routine. Each task served two purposes: readiness and reassurance. He told himself that this was about responsibility, about not turning away a soul in need. Yet beneath that reasoning lay a deeper truth he was not yet ready to face. He was no longer protecting only himself. The woman bore the marks of pursuit that could not be washed away. Old scars traced her arms and shoulders, each one a chapter of resistance against a world determined to erase her. Fresh wounds hinted at narrow escapes, at moments when luck and endurance had aligned just long enough to keep her alive. To the men hunting her, she was a prize or a threat. To the land, she was simply another being fighting to remain. As the day wore on, distant movement flickered along the ridgeline. Not close enough to provoke, not far enough to ignore. The rancher knew the tactic well. Pressure without confrontation. Let hunger, fear, and doubt do the work. It was the same strategy the West had used on countless others before. The house became a boundary, a line drawn not just in soil, but in intention. By allowing her to sleep in his bed, he had extended more than shelter. In the unspoken laws of the frontier and the equally powerful traditions of her people, he had offered protection that carried consequence. Such acts were not temporary. They reshaped futures, whether a man welcomed that truth or not. As the sun climbed higher, the woman stepped outside, testing her strength against the heat. She stood near the porch, feeling the land beneath her feet, reconnecting with something older than fear. Her presence there was a risk, but hiding carried its own dangers. To vanish completely was to invite pursuit. To be seen, briefly and on her own terms, was to remind the world that she still existed. The rancher watched her from the shade, aware that every moment increased the odds of discovery. Yet he did not call her back inside. Control was an illusion out here. Respect was the only currency that held value. She had survived this long by trusting her instincts, and he would not insult them now. That afternoon, the wind shifted. With it came the distant sound of hooves, slow and deliberate. Not a charge, not a patrol, but a message. Someone wanted to be noticed. Someone wanted to test his resolve without yet spilling blood. The R.A. Nair moved with the calm of a man who understood that panic was more lethal than bullets. He positioned himself where he could be seen clearly from the approach, rifle resting, but not raised. The woman retreated into the house, not out of fear, but strategy. If violence came, she would not be taken unaware. The riders never crossed onto the property. They remained just far enough to maintain the illusion of civility, of lawful intent. They wanted him to know they were there. They wanted him to understand that harboring a fugitive carried a cost that would soon come due. When they finally turned away, the silence that followed felt heavier than their presence had. The rancher exhaled slowly, aware that restraint was not mercy. It was simply the prelude to escalation. That night, sleep came in fragments. The desert cooled, but tension did not. Every creak of timber and whisper of wind sharpened his senses. The woman slept again in the same bed, exhaustion claiming her despite the danger. To move her now would have been meaningless. The line had already been drawn. He sat awake beside her, the weight of the decision pressing down harder than any physical burden he had known. He understood now that this was not a matter of days or weeks. The world outside would not forget her, and by extension, it would not forget him. In the quiet, memories surfaced uninvited, losses buried deep, choices made when survival demanded sacrifice. He had believed that chapter of his life was finished, that he had earned the right to exist without entanglement. The desert, it seemed, had other plans. Before dawn, the woman stirred. Her gaze met his, steady and unafraid. There was no gratitude in it, no pleading, only recognition. Recognition of shared risk, recognition of a bond formed not by romance, but by survival and honor. Among her people, such bonds were stronger than words and longer lasting than promises. The days that followed blurred into a pattern of vigilance and quiet connection. She regained strength, moving with increasing confidence through the ranch, helping where she could, learning the rhythms of cattle and fence lines. He adjusted to her presence, though adjustment did not mean comfort. Every shared task deepened the truth he could no longer deny. This was no longer temporary shelter. The land itself seemed to acknowledge the change. The nights grew restless, the wildlife cautious. Even the cattle sensed the tension, bunching closer together as if anticipating a storm. The West had a way of responding to shifts in fate, subtle but unmistakable. On the fourth evening, smoke rose on the horizon where none should have been. Not a campfire, but something larger, less controlled. A signal, perhaps, or a warning. The rancher studied it with narrowed eyes, understanding that the waiting was ending. The woman stood beside him, her posture calm, her resolve unshaken. Whatever had been set in motion by her arrival could no longer be undone. The future approached like a dust cloud, obscuring details but promising impact. As darkness fell, the rancher secured the house once more, knowing that the next sunrise would bring more than light. It would bring a test neither of them could avoid. The desert held its breath. The smoke on the horizon did not fade with nightfall. It lingered like a bruise against the sky, dark and deliberate, a signal meant to be seen by anyone who understood the language of threat. By dawn, it had spread into a low smear, telling the rancher that the men watching his land were no longer content with patience. The waiting had ended. The claiming had begun. The desert awoke uneasy. Birds lifted from brush too early. The cattle shifted restlessly, their low sounds carrying farther than usual in the thin morning air. The rancher moved through his routines with sharpened focus, every action measured, every glance weighted with calculation. He knew this land intimately, but familiarity did not make it kind. It merely made survival possible for those willing to listen. The woman watched from the porch, her posture relaxed but alert, her eyes tracking the same signs he read. She had lived her life beneath the constant shadow of pursuit. Fear had long since been replaced by clarity. Danger no longer startled her, it instructed her. She understood that the smoke meant escalation, and escalation meant blood was closer than ever. The rancher began preparing for the worst, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a quiet acknowledgement of reality. Supplies were moved closer to the house. Water was stored, ammunition counted again. He reinforced the shutters and cleared firing lines around the perimeter, not to invite violence, but to survive it. The land offered little forgiveness to those who hesitated. By midday, the first sign came. A single rider appeared along the far edge of the property, not hiding, not advancing, simply existing where no one had existed the day before. The man sat tall in the saddle, rifle across his back, posture calm enough to be insulting. He represented authority as the West often did, armed, confident, and indifferent to consequence. The rancher did not approach. He understood the game being played. Engagement would legitimize the intrusion. Silence, for now, was its own resistance. The rider eventually turned away, but the message was delivered. The boundary had been acknowledged, and it would not be respected for long. That evening, the wind changed again, carrying unfamiliar scents, sweat, leather, horses. The rancher recognized it immediately. Men were closer now, moving with intent rather than curiosity. The night closed in, heavy and charged, as if stars themselves were bracing for what would unfold. The woman prepared in her own way. She bound her wounds tighter, checked the small blade she kept hidden, and memorized the paths through the brush she could run if the house fell. She had escaped worse situations than this, but never with so much at stake. This time, flight would not mean only her survival. It would mean abandoning something that had already taken root. The rancher sensed that shift even without words. The space between them had changed since the first night. It was no longer defined by caution alone. It carried responsibility, expectation, and a future neither had planned, but both were now guarding. Near midnight, the first shot rang out. It was not aimed at the house. It struck a fence post, splintering wood and announcing intent without immediate carnage. The West favored such warnings. They were invitations to comply before force was required. The rancher did not respond with gunfire. He waited, listening as hooves circled the property under the cover of darkness. The second shot came closer. Glass shattered from a window near the back of the house, the sound sharp and violent in the still night. The woman moved instantly, taking cover where she could observe without being seen. The rancher positioned himself at the front, rifle steady, heart calm in the way that came only from long familiarity with danger. The attackers did not rush. They tested angles, fired sporadically, probing defenses like predators seeking weakness. They wanted him to break, to surrender the woman to spare his land and life. They believed isolation would erode resolve. They were wrong. The rancher returned fire only when necessary, his shots precise, deliberate. He did not aim to kill unless forced to. Even so, blood was spilled. A man cried out in the dark, and the circling slowed. Violence, once introduced, had a way of clarifying intent. The skirmish lasted longer than expected, stretching the night thin. When the attackers finally withdrew, it was not defeat that drove them back, but reassessment. They had learned that the ranch would not fall easily, and that the man defending it was neither reckless nor afraid. Dawn revealed the cost. Blood stained the dirt near the fence line. Hoofprints cut deep into the soil. The house bore fresh scars, but it still stood. The rancher surveyed the damage with a practiced eye, knowing this was only the beginning. Men who retreated alive returned better prepared. The woman emerged as the light strengthened, her gaze moving across the land with a mixture of relief and resolve. She had survived another night, but survival alone was no longer enough. The pattern was clear now. The men hunting her would not stop. They would escalate until one side was erased. By choosing to protect her, the rancher had inherited her war. As the day wore on, the reality of that truth settled deeper. Riders appeared and disappeared along distant ridges. Smoke rose again, closer this time. The land itself seemed to tighten, every sound sharper, every shadow heavier. That afternoon, the rancher buried the fence post that had been shattered, not because it needed repairing immediately, but because ritual mattered. Acts of rebuilding in the face of threat were declarations of intent. He would not be moved easily, not today, not by intimidation alone. The woman assisted silently, her movements efficient despite lingering weakness. She belonged to the land in a way few did, understanding its moods and rhythms instinctively. Together, they worked without conversation, bound by a shared understanding that words could not improve upon. As the sun dipped low once more, the rancher made a decision that had been forming since the first gunshot. Staying was no longer enough. Defense alone would bleed them dry. The West rewarded those who acted, not those who waited to be overwhelmed. He began planning not just for survival, but for change. The woman sensed the shift immediately. Preparation took on a different tone, one of movement rather than endurance. Supplies were organized for travel, routes considered beyond the property lines. The idea of leaving carried risk, but staying now carried certainty. That night, the desert was quieter than it had been in days. Too quiet. The kind of silence that preceded storms and ambushes alike. The rancher stood outside, scanning the darkness, aware that the next move would define everything that followed. Behind him, the house glowed faintly with lamplight, sheltering more than just bodies. It sheltered a future that had arrived uninvited and refused to leave. Somewhere in the darkness, men prepared for another attempt, and somewhere between the land and the stars, fate waited to see who would move first. The decision to leave did not arrive as a sudden thought, but as a slow tightening in the chest, the kind that came when a man realized the ground beneath him was already giving way. The rancher rose before first light, the stars still sharp above the desert, and stood for a long moment listening to the land. It no longer sounded like home, it sounded like a warning. The ranch had been his refuge, carved from labor and loneliness, but refuge could become a trap when enemies learned its shape. Staying meant allowing the hunters to dictate the terms. Leaving meant surrendering the one thing he had built with his own hands. Both choices carried loss. Only one carried motion. He began without ceremony. Supplies were packed with care, not haste. Water skins, dried meat, ammunition, blankets, and tools were chosen with the precision of a man who knew excess could kill as easily as scarcity. He left behind what could not be carried, understanding that survival demanded sacrifice. The land had taught him that lesson many times before. The woman watched, her expression calm but intent. She understood departure differently than he did. For her, movement had always been survival. Routes were a luxury denied to those born under pursuit. Yet even she felt the weight of leaving this place. The ranch had been more than shelter. It had been a promise that something permanent might still exist in a world determined to erase her. By the time the sun broke over the horizon, they were ready. The rancher took one last walk around the property, his boots tracing paths worn deep by years of repetition. He touched the fence posts, the barn door, the porch rail. These were not gestures of sentimentality but acknowledgement. The land had shaped him, and now it was releasing him to whatever came next. They left without looking back. The desert stretched wide and indifferent before them, its beauty sharpened by danger. They traveled away from known trails, choosing routes that bent through dry washes and rocky cuts where tracks were harder to follow. The rancher moved with cautious purpose, but it was the woman who guided their deeper choices. She read the land not as terrain but as story, understanding where men would hesitate and where they would pursue. By midday, the heat pressed down hard, drawing sweat and stealing strength. They rested briefly in the shade of a rock outcrop, conserving water and energy. The silence between them was not awkward. It was filled with mutual understanding, the kind forged when lives are shared under threat. Words would have added nothing. As they traveled, signs of pursuit appeared and vanished. Distant dust clouds, birds lifting suddenly from brush, the unmistakable sense of being watched. The hunters were adjusting, spready out, trying to anticipate rather than react. This was no longer a simple chase. It was a contest of endurance and will. The woman's strength surprised even herself. The rest and care she had received at the ranch had restored more than her body. It had reminded her of something long denied, safety, however temporary. That memory fueled her steps now, turning exhaustion into resolve. She was no longer running alone. As evening approached, the land changed. The open desert gave way to broken hills and narrow passes, places where sound carried strangely and ambush thrived. The ranchers slowed their pace, senses sharpening. This was where mistakes became fatal. They found shelter in a shallow ravine as darkness fell, its walls offering concealment from distant eyes. A small fire was avoided. Smoke was a beacon they could not afford. Instead, they shared food in silence, the act itself a quiet affirmation of shared fate. That night, the desert felt closer, pressing in with unseen movement. The rancher slept lightly, waking often to scan the darkness. Each time, the woman was awake as well, her awareness matching his. Trust between them had grown without declaration, rooted in consistency rather than promise. Somewhere beyond the hills, men followed. The next day brought the first true confrontation since leaving the ranch. It began with sound, the crack of a rifle echoing off stone, closer than expected. The shot struck rock near their position, sending fragments into the air. There was no warning shot this time. The hunters had decided that subtlety was no longer required. The rancher reacted instantly, pulling the woman deeper into cover as more shots followed. The narrow terrain amplified the chaos, making it difficult to determine numbers or position. Dust filled the air, and the sharp scent of gunpowder cut through the dry heat. The woman moved with practiced efficiency, using the terrain to shift position, refusing to become a stationary target. This was not her first encounter with armed pursuit. Survival had taught her adaptability, and now that knowledge became their advantage. The exchange was brief but violent. One of the attackers fell, his body sliding down rock and dirt, the sound final and unmistakable. The others withdrew quickly, unwilling to press into terrain that favored defense. Blood marked the ground, a grim reminder that the chase carried cost on both sides. When silence returned, it was heavier than before. The rancher assessed their situation with grim clarity. The hunters were thinning, but not retreating. Each encounter hardened resolve on both sides. They could not continue like this indefinitely. Movement alone would not be enough. As they continued on, the land began to soften, the harsh rock giving way to grasslands and scattered trees. It was unfamiliar territory for the rancher, but the woman recognized it immediately. These were ancestral paths, places her people had moved through long before borders and laws had attempted to claim them. Here the land felt different, less hostile, more watchful. They reached a hidden valley as night fell, sheltered by trees and water. It was a place that invited pause, not because it was safe, but because it was strategic. The rancher understood that they could not outrun their pursuers forever. At some point they would have to outlast them. In the quiet of that valley, something shifted between them. The exhaustion, the danger, the shared survival stripped away distance. Their proximity was no longer defined by necessity alone. It carried warmth, grounding, and the unspoken acknowledgement that whatever future awaited would be faced together. The land, ancient and observant, seemed to accept them as a single presence rather than two separate lives. The night passed without attack, but neither mistook the calm for peace. It was only the pause between chapters of violence, the breath before the next test. As dawn crept through the trees, the rancher knew that returning to his old life was no longer possible. Even if the hunters vanished, the path behind him had burned away. The future lay ahead, uncertain and dangerous, but no longer solitary. The woman stood at the edge of the valley, watching the light spread, her silhouette steady against the morning. She carried not just her own survival now, but the weight of what had begun to form between them, something that demanded protection as fiercely as any life. The hunters would come again. Of that, there was no doubt. But when they did, they would not find a man running from loss or a woman fleeing alone. They would find a bond forged by fire and pursuit, tempered by land and choice. And the West would decide what it always decided in the end: who endured. The valley held them longer than either had expected. At first it was necessity that anchored them there. The land offered water, concealment, and defensible ground. Three things survival demanded more fiercely than movement. But as days passed and the hunters failed to appear, something else began to take root. Something quieter and far more dangerous than gunfire: stability. The rancher woke each morning to birdsong instead of pursuit. The sound felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, like a gift given too freely. He kept his vigilance sharp, but the valley resisted urgency. It encouraged patience, coaxing him into rhythms he had nearly forgotten, repairing tools, setting simple traps, tending to needs beyond immediate survival. The woman thrived there in a way that startled him. Her strength returned fully, not just in body but in spirit. The land recognized her. She moved through it with confidence. The tea came from ancestral memory rather than experience alone. She knew where roots grew thickest, where animals passed at dawn, where the ground softened enough for planting. This was not hiding, this was inhabiting. For the first time since her flight began, she was not merely surviving. She was existing. The rancher observed this transformation with a mixture of awe and unease. He had spent years convincing himself that solitude was safety, that attachment was a weakness the West exploited without mercy. Yet here, in this hidden place, he watched life assert itself despite every reason it should not. They built small structures from fallen branches and stone, nothing permanent, nothing that announced presence from afar. Still, the acts themselves carried meaning, each shelter wall stacked carefully, each fire pit shaped with intention. These were not the movements of people preparing to flee at a moment's notice. These were the movements of people beginning something. The nights grew warmer, the air heavy with the promise of change. The desert beyond the valley still existed, harsh and unyielding, but within this pocket of land, time slowed. The urgency of pursuit faded into the background, replaced by quieter concerns: food stores, weather shifts, the passing of weeks. The rancher noticed changes he could not explain away with logic alone. The woman's steps grew measured, protective. Her appetite shifted. She rested more, listening inward as much as outward. Among her people the signs were unmistakable. Life announced itself not with words but with subtle rearrangements of the body and spirit. The realization struck him not as shock, but as inevitability. The night she confirmed it, the valley was wrapped in moonlight, silver and still. The rancher sat by the fire repairing a strap when the weight of understanding settled fully into place. What had begun shelter had become legacy. What had been survival had crossed into continuation. The idea frightened him more than any rifle ever had. Children were not abstractions in the West. They were responsibility made flesh. They bound people to the future whether they were ready or not. And readiness, he understood, was irrelevant. The land did not ask permission before planting seed. It only demanded care once growth began. The woman carried this truth without fear. Among her people, life was not postponed until conditions were perfect. It was welcomed whenever it arrived, because arrival itself was a victory against a world that tried relentlessly to erase them. To create life under pursuit was not recklessness, it was defiance. The rancher wrestled with the weight of it in silence. He thought of the ranch he had left behind, the land he might never reclaim. He thought of the men still hunting, the danger that had not vanished but merely retreated. He thought of bringing new life into a world that had shown itself so cruel. And yet when he looked at the woman standing at the edge of the valley, one hand resting instinctively against her body, he felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Purpose. The hunters returned sooner than expected. It began with signs rather than shots. Tracks near the water source. A broken branch placed too deliberately to be accident. The valley had been found, not by chance, but by persistence. The men following them had learned patience as well. The rancher knew immediately that everything had changed. This was no longer about escape. Running again would only prolong the inevitable. The valley, for all its shelter, was now a liability. If they stayed, the confrontation would come on terms chosen by their enemies. If they moved, they risked exposure with far more at stake than before. The woman sensed the danger as keenly as he did, but her response was different now. Where once she would have prepared to vanish, she now prepared to defend. Her movements carried a new gravity, a protective instinct sharpened by what she carried within her. The rancher recognized that instinct instantly. It mirrored his own. They planned without words, guided by shared understanding. The valley would be abandoned before dawn, but not in flight. They would leave signs behind, false trails, deliberate misdirection, turning the hunters' patience against them. Before they departed, the rancher stood alone for a moment, pressing his palm into the earth. He did not know if this land would remember them, but he wanted it to know they had not been defeated here. They were choosing motion, not surrender. The journey out was harder than any before. The woman tired quickly now, and the rancher adjusted pace without hesitation. Every mile carried risk, every pause invited discovery. The West did not slow for vulnerability, it tested it. When the first shots came, they came too close for comfort. The hunters had anticipated misdirection. They were closer than expected, emboldened by the narrowing gap. The exchange was brutal and fast. The rancher fought with a ferocity born not of anger but of protection. Each movement was calculated to shield rather than to pursue. Blood was spilled again, but not theirs. Still, the cost was clear. They could not endure many more encounters like this. Attrition favored those who could replace losses. They could not. As night fell, they reached higher ground, a place where the land dropped away sharply on three sides. It was not a place to settle. It was a place to make a stand if forced. The ranchers surveyed it with grim acceptance. This was where the chase would end one way or another. The woman rested beside him, exhaustion heavy but resolve unbroken. The life she carried was fragile, yet it had already reshaped everything around it. It demanded future where only survival had existed before. The rancher understood then that his fear was no longer about death. It was about failing to protect what had begun to grow. The stars emerged one by one, cold and distant witnesses to choices made far below. Somewhere in the darkness, the hunters gathered for what they believed would be the final pursuit. They did not yet understand that the West had a habit of siding with those who fought not just to live, but to continue. As dawn approached, the rancher prepared himself for the last stand or the last escape, knowing either would decide more than his own fate. It would decide whether this story ended with loss or with beginnings carved stubbornly into the unforgiving land. Dawn arrived pale and uncertain, as though even the sun hesitated to witness what would follow. The high ground where they had taken refuge stood like a final question posed to the land itself. Three sides dropped sharply into rock and scrub, funnels of exposure where any advance would be seen long before it arrived. The fourth side narrowed into a winding ascent, difficult for horses and unforgiving to men on foot. It was not a fortress, but it was honest terrain, one that rewarded preparation and punished arrogance. The rancher rose before the first light fully claimed the sky. He moved quietly, checking sight lines, measuring distances, memorizing angles. This was not desperation, it was clarity. He understood now that survival had reached its final chapter, and whatever followed would not be shaped by luck alone. Behind him, the woman rested against stone, her breathing steady despite exhaustion. The life she carried had altered her center of gravity, but not her resolve. If anything, it had sharpened it. She no longer belonged only to herself or to the past she had outrun. She belonged to what came next. The hunters revealed themselves just after sunrise. They came without subtlety this time, figures emerging along the ascent, rifles visible, confidence unmistakable. Their patience had curdled into certainty. They believed the chase had ended because the hunted had nowhere left to go. They were wrong about one thing. The rancher did not wait for them to reach comfortable range. He acted first, not with recklessness, but with intention. Each shot he fired was placed with purpose, to disrupt formation, to force hesitation, to remind them that every step forward carried cost. The land amplified the sound, turning each report into a warning that echoed through the ravines. The hunters returned fire, bullets striking stone, sending fragments flying. Dust filled the air, stinging eyes and lungs alike. The woman stayed low, protected by the terrain, her awareness fixed not on fear but on timing. This was not her first battle, but it was the first she fought with a future bound inside her. The exchange stretched into hours, neither side willing to yield. The hunters attempted flanking maneuvers, but the terrain betrayed them. Every path narrowed, every advance exposed. Their numbers dwindled as injuries mounted, frustration replacing confidence. The rancher felt the strain settle into his bones. His movements slowed, not from doubt, but from the honest limits of flesh. Still he held his ground. He understood something the hunters did not. This was not a man fighting to survive. This was a man fighting to ensure something survived after him. When the moment came, it arrived quietly. A misstep, a shift in wind, a pause where there should not have been one. The rancher seized it without hesitation, driving the attackers back just enough to break their momentum. One by one, they withdrew, not in defeat, but in recognition. The pursuit had cost too much already. Whatever prize they sought was no longer worth the blood required to claim it. The land reclaimed its silence slowly. The rancher stood where he was, breathing hard, the weight of the last weeks pressing down all at once. He did not chase them. He did not celebrate. He simply remained, allowing the truth to settle. The hunt was over, not because one side had been destroyed, but because endurance had outlasted cruelty. As the dust settled, the woman rose carefully, joining him at the edge of the high ground. The valley below lay open and empty, no movement betraying retreating enemies. For the first time in longer than either could remember, the horizon carried no immediate threat. They did not linger. The West had taught them that safety was never permanent, only relative, but it had also taught them when to move forward rather than merely away. They descended carefully, leaving the battlefield behind, carrying with them not triumph, but survival earned honestly. Days later they reached a place far from old trails and familiar maps, a stretch of land ignored by ambition and spared by conflict. Water flowed nearby. The soil, though stubborn, promised life to those willing to work it. The land did not reject them. It accepted them quietly. They built again, not with the urgency of flight, but with the patience of intention. Each post driven into the ground was a claim not of ownership, but of presence. Each wall raised was an agreement with the future. This was not the ranch he had lost, and it was not the past she had fled. It was something new. The seasons turned, as they always did, indifferent yet reliable. The woman's body changed with time, carrying visible proof that life had insisted on continuing despite everything that had tried to stop it. The rancher adapted, learning a different rhythm, one shaped not by isola, but by responsibility shared. The land tested them, as it always tested those who dared to settle. Drought came and passed. Storms tore at what they had built. Yet each challenge was met not alone, but together. The West respected that kind of persistence. When the time came, it arrived without ceremony, just as everything important in their story had. Life entered the world quietly, stubborn and undeniable, proof that survival could grow into legacy if guarded fiercely enough. The rancher stood outside as dawn broke that day, the same way he had so many mornings before. But this dawn felt different. The silence no longer pressed in. It held space. He understood then that the West had not taken everything from him. It had stripped him down to what mattered. The woman rested inside, surrounded by the warmth of what they had built. She had not escaped her past by running forever. She had faced it, endured it, and carried it forward into something that could not be erased so easily. Years later, travelers would pass near that land and feel something they could not name, a sense of grounding, of lives lived with intention, of stories written not in words but in choices that refused to surrender. The West would continue to be cruel. History would continue to forget those it found inconvenient. But somewhere beneath the wide sky, beyond the reach of old hatreds and fading laws, a family endured, not because the world had allowed it, but because they had chosen it. And in the end, that was the only victory the land ever truly respected.